This land was once cloaked in a forest of giant trees. Of all the trees in this ancient forest, kauri was the largest. A 100 years ago, these forests were destroyed. Now, only a handful of the old giants still stand. These survivors are amongst the oldest living organisms on Earth. But their future hangs in the balance once again. A disease has emerged that is killing kauri, devastating many healthy trees and threatening the regeneration of an iconic species.
Nei te kura huna. Kare e kitea. O tai mātou. Te hanga papai o tēnei.
Kauri is such an iconic species for Māori. We knew of kauri before we migrated to Aotearoa. We used some of the different species of kauri within the Pacific Islands to create our huge ocean-going waka. The relationship between the kauri that's used for ocean-going waka, our tupuna have whakapapa that relates us to the tohora, or the parawa, so to the whale. And there are karakia that mention te pū or te whenua. And what they're talking about is the iconic kauri or tōtara tree within Te Waunui. And they liken it to when the whale, during their boom period, when they stand erect with their tail up in the air and they boom, their sonic boom around the world, calling for their whanaunga. And that's exactly the same as the kauri standing majestically within the ngahere. So the relationship is one of reverberance that the kauri sings. You're learning from an Indigenous perspective about the creation of Te Waunui, the creation of the relationship from an esoteric belief system that kauri is our brother, that these trees are our brothers and sisters, and that we have a whakapapa that links us to the gods and to creation. And so what you're actually talking about is our Indigenous knowledge of the creation of the biosphere. And so part of that creation myth is trees do not stand upright. Their feet are in the heavens and their head is in the ground. You see the different concept? And so when you believe that, then these pillars are the right way round. So from a strictly Māori perspective, those are its feet. And so the nurturing part is here on Papatūānuku. This is the Earth Mother. And this is where the nurturing part of our head is resting. And so you look at the nurturing part is all of this biodiversity around. It's the humus that I'm sitting on. It's the insects and the other biodiversity that we can see here, because this is the nurturer. And so what we've been talking about with the relationship of the different trees that are here is really the key to its oranga. I think once people begin to understand that there's a link between ourselves and the insects and nature and birds and the sky and the earth, then they become very passionate like us about what we call mā tauranga Māori. Mā is enlightenment, kia tā, nā wai i tā, who created that, kia u, kia tāu. So to make part of your every part of your fabric, to internalize it, to understand it, the knowledge that's been given. And ranga, te rangaranga, that's the wairua, the wairua of the ngahere, the wairua of the tangata. So mankind understands the bird life, understands the life cycle of the insect that it predates on, understands the home that it finds within the bark of the tree, and the time of the year that little bug is eaten by the bird, and then the bird gives its bird song to identify the tree. And so that's the mā tauranga Māori part, is understanding those life cycles, the koeketanga, because that's also the life cycle of the tree.
Each kauri begins its life cycle high up in the branches of the parent tree, producing prolific amounts of seed inside the tightly whirled cones. As the cones ripen in autumn, they disintegrate on the branches, scattering their winged seeds to the ground. Each seed an opportunity. But the forest floor can be a harsh environment for a tiny seed. On average, only 1% of the seed fall will germinate. Once germinated, seedlings can survive very long periods of time with little growth. Waiting for the opportunity to begin the push for the sky. When a young tree has become established, it begins a rapid growth phase. Juveniles grow tall and straight and are known as rikas. They can be found in huge stands where kauri are naturally regenerating. Over several hundred years, these young kauri will grow straight up until they break the canopy and capture a place in the sun. After 500 years, the emergent tree has established an almost exclusive ecological domain. The influence on its surroundings extending into the air and far throughout the ground beneath. Each season, the cycle begins anew, and more trees are born into the whānau of the Ngahere. In a magnificent transformation, this tiny seed becomes one of the largest of all living organisms.
What most people see when they're exploring the forest is everything at eye level or maybe between their feet, but actually there's heaps more to see, especially when you look up. There's a whole world of plants and animals and insects and birds that live up above our heads in the canopy, and it's a world that not many people have explored. We don't know much about the ecology of the canopy at all. It's just been so hard to get there and a little dangerous. So there's heaps to still discover. This is a really great community of epiphytes here. We've got a large nest epiphyte from which these large ferns are growing. So this one's Pētako, which is a Splenium polyodon. And you can always spot this one because it's got a double serration on the fronds and beautiful sori on the back. And then this big spectacular one here closer to the trunk is a hanging club moss, which has leaves that change whether they're younger or older. And it makes large green curtains in the canopy, which you can see would be a great place to come and hide if you're an insect or maybe even a bird. It's a beautiful example of a large community up here. We've seen quite a few species along the way. We've seen nest epiphytes, which are the large flax-like species, and we've seen a threatened shrub species that was growing out of the nest epiphyte. And up here, right next to me, is a very special shrub epiphyte called puka. And this is an interesting one that sends a root all the way down the host, back down to the forest floor if it needs more access to water and nutrients. Each host tree provides different things for the epiphytes and the climbers and the fauna that lives within those. So depending on how long the tree's been there, how big it is, where in the forest it's growing, each kauri tree will have a different community of epiphytes and vines. And then a kauri tree may also differ from a rimu or a rata tree. So this kauri tree has quite a few species and a lot of large individuals because it's quite old. So it's been here a long time, and there's been more time for those plants to establish and take hold. And also the forks in these branches are big enough to support the plants without the shedding bark causing any worries for them. Like most plant communities, epiphytes have a pattern that they tend to arrive in. So we start with the really drought-tolerant species that will grow out on the edges of the branches, often when the tree is really young, and those will be the lichens usually, and that will be followed by moss and normally orchids or small ferns. And once they start establishing, they facilitate the arrival of more species because there's more moisture and more detritus building up. And that creates almost like a base where bigger plants can arrive. So when their seeds land, they're not landing on bare bark, they're landing on a nice mat of moss. And they can start growing larger and larger, and then we get these big nest epiphytes. Once they arrive, then it just takes off because of the canopy soil they're trapping within their leaves. Things like this puka, these shrub epiphytes, can get started, and once that happens, we get these really diverse and large communities. So it's a pattern of facilitation with each species providing something for the next to arrive. And that's also home to a lot of insects. It's a feeding and nesting place for birds and even reptiles. We've got geckos that live up here in the canopy inside those nests, so it's lots of ecosystems within ecosystems. If you think about it, the canopy's like the interface between the earth and the sky. Way up here, we're both emitting and nutrients and gas cycles and water cycles and interacting. It's a unique world in itself. There's plants and animals up here that occur nowhere else in New Zealand.
Kauri once dominated these subtropical rainforests, thriving in the high rainfall and warm coastal air. Where the huge trees are, there are often mists clinging to the hills like a blanket. Kauri are only found in the north of Te Ika Maui, Aotearoa. The trees forming statuesque islands in the scrambling mass of subtropical rainforest. Each stand of kauri is tuned to its location, soil type, landform, and climate. There is no typical kauri forest, but wherever kauri are found, there are unique assemblages of plants and animals. Ancient animal relics like the Archie's frog and the striped gecko have survived alongside these trees and are part of its unique natural history. Like the kauri, they too are critically endangered. The unique nature of kauri forest determines the ecology of many plants and animals. And so too, it may also determine their fate.
The kauri tree is an ecosystem engineer. Another way of putting it, it drives the whole landscape. So you get these big trees behind me, which is probably more than 500 years old, and they create their own ecosystem, and everything has evolved with it. And so kauri used to cover more than 1 million hectares in New Zealand. It's been logged and it's been cleared to less than 1% of its original area, and this 1% exists in tiny little fragments such as we're sitting. And how has this affected these forests? You know, has it diminished their resilience? They can no longer talk to each other. Māori believe that everything's connected, everything has a whakapapa, everything has a place, and everything belongs for something. Like, nothing exists by itself. It has something else that affects it. Fungi in the soil, for example, is something that we know that affects trees. You know, it has a symbiotic association with trees. And Māori know that, and there's a fungi for every stage of a tree. There's a fungi to decompose it, there's a fungi that feeds it. And they know that the forests are connected through networks underground, and that the trees do talk to each other. And also the birds and the insects affect the trees. And so, I mean, they're aware of this whole whakapapa assemblage, that everything's connected and related. And it's realising the connection underground in the soils that informs everything that happens on the land. That's something that Māori bring to that body of knowledge in terms of soil science. There's two things that make kauri soil unique. First of all, it creates its own soil environment. It's a podzol. And because of this, I'm sitting on is a massive leaf litter mound here. It's a rare type of soil, but it's a famous type of soil. And it's truly what they call podzols, podzolisation or eggshell effect. And so you have a completely different soil environment that's probably quite toxic to some soil organisms, but others seem to thrive in it. Forest soils are usually dominated by fungal communities, right? So if I was to dig up some soil here and I was to extract DNA to see who's in it, you'd find it mostly fungal species in the soil. However, if I was to go just out there in the pasture, that's bacterial species. So it has a completely different environment based on the plants that grow in it, but also the chemistry that the plant leaf litter contributes to. Because these kauri trees, they feed through their roots, but via the leaf litter system, what we call filter feeders. So these roots extend for ages through the land, and they're very shallow as well. And so basically everything that leaches from that is what the kauri feeds on.
Throughout its life cycle, kauri constantly engineer their environment. A never-ceasing flow of material falls from the trees. They shed their skin over and over, dropping bark, leaves, cones, branches, and even entire limbs can be discarded. In what is part of a supremely unique method of allelopathy, the process in which plants cast elements into their surrounding environment to prevent competition and encourage new whānau. The most important part of this process is that the constant shedding of material changes the soil structure. The conditions become customized to the extent that some species only occur beneath kauri. Unusual orchids and other drought-tolerant plants make up these dynamic species assemblages, thriving in the nutrient-poor soil. It is within these dense layers of soil that the kauri killer has dwelt, undetected.
Pathogens and disease are a normal part of forests. There's probably a lot more going on than we realise, even in a healthy natural forest. Various diseases will be nibbling away on the roots of trees and just having a subtle effect that's not really obvious and dramatic. And there will be occasions where trees are killed by a disease. And it's all just part of that cycling and rotation of the forest system. But what we've got with the kauri dieback is something quite different, where we've got an exotic disease has come in, and the trees don't have any resistance to it. The disease that's causing kauri dieback is a Phytophthora. It's called Phytophthora agathodicida. So Phytophthora is an organism, a microorganism. It looks like a fungus, it acts like a fungus, but it's not really a fungus. So we say it's a fungus-like organism. And it comes from a genus of plant pathogens that cause death and decay of plants from all sorts of species, from herbs through to giant trees. So how they usually start is perhaps as a resting spore in the soil. So these resting spores can last for many years perhaps in the soil, just waiting for their opportunity. And then they germinate and they release a little zoospore. Now a zoospore is a swimming spore. You can think of it like a sperm with two tails. And these things swim through the soil and latch on to the root of a host that is particularly desirable to them, in this case, to kauri. But the zoospores themselves don't move through the roots. Zoospores will attach on the outside of the root and then drop their little flagella, their tails that help them to swim, and then they'll germinate and actually grow a thread, a hyphae, that goes through the roots. And it'll go first of all between cells, but then start rotting the cells as well as it works its way through the roots. The reason that you start seeing the symptom of the leaf yellowing or the tree dieback is because it's losing so many of its feeder roots that it can no longer support itself. And the extreme of that is when the pathogen gets all the way into the lower trunk. As the pathogen rots the lower trunk, it just gradually spreads right around. Now the tree relies on that bark to get the food supply down into the roots. And as soon as you cut off that living bark, the tree can't get nutrients down to the roots and it dies. The sap bleeds around the edge of those lesions. I guess you could say it's the tree trying to heal itself and trying to seal off that wound. But the disease, the pathogen actually spreads beyond that and keeps on advancing, and the kauri tree can't keep up. So the bleeds just keep on advancing up the trunk as the disease progresses. Seeing a kauri forest with dieback it's devastating. It's heartbreaking when you see giant trees that have been standing for 1,000 years or more dying very quickly from this thing that humans have introduced to the forest. To see that destruction on a huge scale, whether it's in a regenerating rika stand like the one we're in now, or whether it's in a forest of giants up in the north, it does have a real impact on you. I've seen the same thing with communities, for example, in Titirangi, where you've got people, you've got their houses in amongst these trees, and they're looking out their window every day and seeing dying trees. It really impacts on them emotionally. So when you get kauri dieback in the forest, you are changing the whole ecosystem because you're taking kauri out as the dominant tree. You'll still have a forest, but it's just going to be a very different makeup of trees, of species. And you're going to lose a lot of things that would have been in the kauri forest and won't be in whatever replaces it. Yeah, it is the forest that is dying, it's not just the kauri tree. Since we worked out what was causing the death of kauri in the early 2000s, so it was probably about 2006 that we worked out it was this Phytophthora that was causing the damage, particularly in the Waitakere ranges. It's been found in a lot more places, and the more we look, the more areas that we find the kauri dieback. Humans are probably one of the biggest causes of spread. The spores can survive in the soil for many years. And the spores are tiny. You can't see them. They're about 30 microns across, so you could fit about 10,000 on a pinhead. So these things are tiny. But any one of them could theoretically start a new disease patch. So what happens if people walk through the forest, they pick up mud on their boots. That mud could contain potentially hundreds or thousands of these spores. They then wear those boots in another bit of forest somewhere. A piece of that infected soil drops off and could potentially start a new infection. It could take many years before you notice that it's happened. I like to think that we as a people can do what's right for kauri forest because we've stuffed it up so far. And I think we need to redress things by being really proactive in what we do to stop it spreading, because it's going to be very hard to do anything about it once it's in a forest. We've got to try and stop it getting into the forests that are currently clean.
When you have this Phytophthora come in and kill these trees, and this disease kills seedlings to mature trees like this one behind me, and what happens when these trees go, we'll see an influx of invasive species, other woody species, and we'll see the loss of all those other codependent plant species and insect species. For Māori who exists within kauri's natural range, kauri's been part of their conversation for hundreds of years. It's an ancestor, it's one of them. So if they lose an ancestor, it's like losing a person. It would be devastating. Most iwi, their mana is associated with managing the forest, so the health of the forest, they say, is related to the health of the people. So if these forests go, the health of the people go alongside with it. It's devastating. It is truly like losing a family member. Kauri dieback disease isn't that fussy. It does infect other plant species, so what we call alternate hosts. So a tree could be infected with Phytophthora agathodissa, but we would never see the signs. And while the Phytophthora is infecting this tree and creating spores and sporulation, that's a huge risk for Kauri nearby. So these are the things we need to know in terms of managing the disease. Is like, what are the alternative hosts, particularly what are the asymptomatic hosts, and how are these related to Kauri? So if we go back to the Māori side of things, it's like one of the, methods that has been promoted is to look at the overall forest health. So looking at other signs for the forest like plant health and associations and insects. That's probably a nice example of where science meets mātauranga. They seem to agree on the same, principles and hypotheses going forward. I care about the loss of Kauri because it represents a piece of New Zealand history that once it's gone forever. I think we're on a slippery slope here where we're losing so much of our biodiversity, so much of our environment, that it almost feels like there'll be nothing left. And so fighting for Kauri, I think, is a good example for fighting for everything else. It represents the fight for other things as well.
These giant kauri were once slaughtered to the brink of extinction, and resilience has been lost, making it easy for disease to take hold. To defend against this disease, we must look to understand the forest as a whole. Because resilience is in diversity. Mātauranga Māori recognises this diversity through its interwoven concepts of ecology and whanaungatanga. New projects are underway to better understand the health of the forest and explore ways to heal trees through mātauranga and rongoā practice. These projects bring hope to a dire situation. If we walk into the forest and see each living thing as not separate, if we imagine the complexity of roots and fungi in the soil, we glimpse the sky gardens in the branches, and we understand that everything is connected, that the ngahere is an assemblage of families with relationships interwoven over immense timescales, then we can understand that we are also connected to that ecosystem of the forest, and that we all have a part to play in safeguarding our ancient home.
E ngā rangatira, e ngā maunga, e ngā wai, e te kāhui tangata tēnā raputai. Ko reira, ki te atu kōtai.
And now, if we look at the construct of a house, it's the same as the construct of this cathedral that we're sitting in the Ngahere. We have our Pou Whakairo, being our Lākau rangatira. We have our ancestors from right back being the kauri, who we can refer to as Tāne Mahuta. And all of that is intrinsic in this whare, the whare of the Ngahere. So that when you start looking at the kaitiakitanga of the Ngahere, and in particular iconic species like kauri, understanding the biomass and what's growing there, the bugs and all of the insects within the soil, it's alive, you know, and you can be really happy that this tree is on the journey to health. And so the only thing that would affect it is if it came from an outside, you know, outside and was brought in, that the human vector becomes part of the thing that we have to look at, because if they've come from infected forest, very quickly this too can become an infected forest just through not cleaning the dirt off their boots. So, you know, that's kaitiakitanga. Yeah, it's implicit that if you love nature, you've got to love looking at how to protect it. Mm.
Nō reira, tēnei te mihi ake rā ki a koe e tāi. Nei te manaakitanga. I uhia mai nei marunga i a tēnā o tātou. Nō reira, i tēnei wā me huri te iho, te waka pāinga, te whakaaro, mā tēnā here tiaki rā i a koe. Taipai ai ki ngā manu. Nā ngangara, nā puti, i āwhina pai hoki ki a koe. Nā reira, tuturu whakamaua ki a tīna, haumie, ui e, tāe ki e.
I te ao ko hatu, koru ka moe a ngana, ka puta ko te whana, o te ko hatu e. Ko te ao tu, ko te ao hore, ko hine tua hoanga he puna kōrero. Oro toki oro pānamu. Ko te mahi arata he tuaraka, ai waka. E mahi ke tā te hakuture, te whakaraia ta maora e. Nā hine te karakia. Nā ngā toki e. I orohia ki tōna tuaiwi. E tohu